Corinne Ashgrove had learned, in her 3 years at Whitfield and Cross, that the annual partners' retreat was not a vacation. It was an audition that lasted 4 days, held every June at a lakeside property called Thistlewood Lodge, and every associate who wanted to make partner understood that the real work happened, not in the conference room but on the dock at sunset, in the low, murmured conversations over gin and tonics, in the careful choreography of who sat beside whom at dinner. She had packed for it the way she packed for a closing argument. 3 outfits vetted twice, low heels that could survive gravel paths, a cardigan for the evening, chill off the water. She had not packed for her husband, because her husband was not supposed to be part of the audition at all. Weston Calder had been invited, as all the spouses were invited, as an afterthought, stitched onto the bottom of the engraved card. And guessed. Corinne had almost left that line blank on the RSVP. She hadn't, because 6 years of marriage had taught her that leaving Wes at home, when something mattered to her, was its own kind of small cruelty. Even if she sometimes worried, in the private, ungenerous corner of her mind, she was ashamed of what the partners would make of him. Weston restored old buildings, barns, mostly, and the occasional stone chapel or collapsing farmhouse that some historical society wanted saved instead of bulldozed. He worked with his hands in a way that left them permanently marked, a thin white scar across one knuckle from a chisel that had slipped in his 20s. Calluses that never fully softened no matter how much lotion. Corinne bought him for Christmas. He did not own a suit that fit him well, because he had never needed one, and he did not know the names of the partners at Whitfield and Cross, because Corinne had never quite figured out how to fold that part of her life into the part of her life that involved barn beams and hand-forged nails. They had met the way people meet in stories. Nobody expects to become their own. A burst pipe in Corinne's first apartment. A call to a restoration outfit that mostly did barns, but occasionally, for extra cash, took on desperate plumbing emergencies for tenants whose landlords wouldn't answer the phone. Wes had shown up at 11 at night in the same boots he wore everywhere, fixed the pipe in 40 minutes, and refused to take payment for what he called half an hour's work and a decent excuse to meet you. She had been in her 2nd year of law school then, exhausted and underslept and entirely unprepared for how disarming it would be to watch a man solve a real physical problem with his hands, instead of a brief. 6 years later, she still sometimes caught herself doing the math of how far apart their worlds had started, and how little that distance had ever seemed to matter to him. It mattered to her more than she liked to admit, though not because she loved him less for it, but because she had spent her whole career building version of herself that belonged in rooms like Whitfield and Cross's conference hall, and some quiet, anxious part of her had never quite believed that version could hold 2 truths at once, that she could be a woman on partner track, and also a woman married to a man who came home some nights smelling of sawdust and creek water with dirt under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing fully removed. She hated that part of herself. She had never told Wes it existed. He would not have understood it, she thought, because he had never once needed the world's approval to know exactly who he was. And some nights, lying beside him, she envied that certainty more than she envied anything else about him. He arrived at Thistlewood Lodge a full day after everyone else, because a delivery of reclaimed oak had come in late to a job site 3 counties over, and he'd wanted to see it unloaded properly before he left. Corinne had spent that first day alone, at the long table on the lodge's screened porch, half listening to Harriet Voss, senior partner, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who complimented your shoes in a tone that made you check the label twice, talk about her son's admission to a school Corinne had never heard of, and she had felt, with each hour that passed, more and more like a woman standing at the edge of a party she hadn't quite been invited to. Wes texted her from the gravel drive a little after 6 the next evening. Here, parking behind the lodge, looks full up front. She went to meet him, grateful, relieved, already smiling before she reached the corner of the building. And then she saw him, and her stomach dropped, in a way she hated herself for. He'd come straight from the job site. His jeans were streaked pale with dried mortar dust. His flannel shirt had a tear at one elbow. He clearly hadn't noticed. And his work boots, the same steel-toed boots he wore every day of his life. Boots that had walked through more mud and sawdust and creek water than Corinne could count, were caked to the ankle in a drying, gray-brown crust that flacked off with every step he took across the lodge's manicured lawn. "Hey," he said, and kissed her temple, and she caught the smell of cut wood and truck exhaust on him, a smell she loved on any ordinary evening of her life, and that she now, for one shameful second, wished had waited until he'd showered. "You didn't have time to change," she said, and heard how it came out, and hated it. "Didn't want to be later than I already was." He shrugged, easy, unbothered, the way he was about most things that didn't involve a level or a plumb line. "It's a retreat. Core, I figured muddy boots were the whole point of a place like this." It was not, as it turned out, the point. She learned that within the hour, when she brought him up the porch steps and into the wash of golden lamplight where the partners had gathered before dinner, and Harriet Voss's eyes went, with the swift, practiced efficiency of a woman assessing a stranger's usefulness, straight to his boots. "Oh, are you with the grounds crew?" Harriet asked, not unkindly, in the tone of someone asking a perfectly reasonable question. The lodge manager said someone might be coming by about the dock repair. "No, ma'am, I'm with her." Wes nodded toward Corinne, easy as ever, no flush of embarrassment, no defensive edge. He had never in his life needed to prove himself to a room, which was one of the things Corinne loved most about him, and, in that particular moment, on that particular porch, one of the things that frightened her. There was a small silence, the kind that has weight to it, and then Harriet's mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, "how lovely. I do hope you'll wipe those off before you track the lawn in with us." A ripple of soft laughter went around the group. Not cruel, exactly, or not cruel enough that anyone could be called out for it. Just the low, complicit laughter of people who have decided, without discussing it, that someone doesn't quite belong. Corinne felt her face go hot. She reached for something to say and found nothing, and hated herself for finding nothing, and hated the porch and the lamplight, and the whole engraved and guessed of it all. Wes only glanced down at his boots, unbothered, and said, "Fair point," and excused himself to go find a hose. Dinner that night was long, and Corinne spent most of it watching her husband from across the table, trying to gauge whether the evening had wounded him the way it had wounded her. He didn't seem wounded. He ate his salmon, asked one of the younger associates polite questions about a case she was working, and laughed, once, genuinely, at something the caterer's assistant said while refilling water glasses, the kind of easy warmth he extended to everyone, regardless of what they did for a living or how much money they made doing it. A quality Corinne had once found effortlessly romantic, and now, watching Harriet's eyes flick toward him with faint, proprietary amusement, found herself defending in her head, like a closing argument she hadn't been asked to give. It was Grant Whitfield, the firm's founding partner, silver-haired, the kind of man whose silence commanded more attention than most people's speeches, who brought up the deed. They were on the porch again after dinner, the partners nursing scotch in the blue dark, when one of the newer partners, a man named Osei, who'd made partner only that spring, asked Grant how the firm had first found Thistlewood Lodge. It had become tradition to ask this every year, the way families retell the same story at holidays until it hardens into myth. "Property management company," Grant said. "We've leased it every June for 11 years. Never met the owner. The management company handles everything: booking, upkeep, repairs. Frankly, I've always assumed it was some trust fund somewhere, letting the place sit empty most of the year and collecting rent from firms like ours every June." 11 years, and you've never even met them?" Osei asked. "Never had reason to." Though Grant paused, and something crossed his face. A small frown of memory. "Funny thing, Sarah, the management Coordinator mentioned this year the owner wanted to come by in person this time. Something about the lease renewal. Should be arriving tomorrow morning, apparently. I assumed we'd get some silver-haired octogenarian in a linen suit. Corinne, half listening from the porch swing where she sat beside Wes, felt him go very still beside her. Not tense, exactly. Attentive. In a way that was unlike him. Wes rarely paid close attention to firm gossip, had a talent for letting conversations about billable hours wash over him like weather. She glanced at him. He was looking at his hands. "You all right?" she murmured. "Yeah," he said. "Just tired." But he didn't say anything else that evening, and when they went up to their room, he was quieter than usual, standing at the window for a long time, looking out at the dark shape of the lake, before he finally came to bed. The owner arrived the next morning at 9:30, while the partners were finishing coffee on the porch and the associates were pretending to read case files they had no intention of reading. On a lake in June, Corinne heard the truck before she saw it. Not a sleek car, but an old, dependable pickup, dust-colored, with a toolbox bolted into the bed, and she watched Harriet Voss's face arrange itself into the particular expression of a woman preparing to be gracious to someone she had already decided did not deserve graciousness. Then the truck door opened, and Wes stepped out. He'd showered that morning, but he was in his work clothes again, clean jeans this time, a fresh flannel, and yes, his boots, because they were the only boots he owned, though these ones were newly polished. Buffed to a soft matte shine, he must have done at some point before dawn while Corinne slept. He walked up the gravel path toward the porch with the folder of papers under one arm, and the silence that fell over the assembled partners had an entirely different texture than the silence from 2 nights before. "Morning," Wes said, and nodded to Grant Whitfield specifically, the way a man nods to someone he's about to do business with. "Sorry about the truck." Figured a suit and a rental car would just confuse things further. Grant Whitfield set down his coffee cup very slowly. "Weston," he said, testing the name, and Corinne watched something click into place behind his eyes. The guest list, the way she'd introduced him on the first night, half heard and half forgotten in the churn of 100 other names. "Your Sarah said the owner would be." "I'm the owner," Wes confirmed. He set his folder down on the porch table and opened it, and Corinne, crossing the porch to stand beside him, saw the top document without meaning to, a deed. The paper gone soft and yellowed with age at its folds. A name typed across the top in the flat serif of an old typewriter. Weston James Calder. Not his father's name. Not a company. His. "My grandfather built this lodge with his own hands in 1962, Wes said, in the same easy, unhurried voice he used to explain a barn's joinery to a client, as though this were simply the next ordinary fact of the day. Timber framed the whole thing himself, laid every stone in that chimney. He left it to my mother. My mother left it to me 8 years back, when she moved south. I lease it out through the management company because I'm gone most of the year on restoration jobs, and I don't have the time to run it myself. But I still do the maintenance walkthrough every June, before the summer bookings really get going. Check the joists, the roofline, make sure nobody's grandkids have been standing on furniture." He almost smiled. "Usually, the tenants have already checked out by the time I come through. This year I got my dates crossed. Guess I came a little early." Nobody on the porch said anything for a long moment. Corinne watched Harriet Voss's face do something complicated. A fast, silent recalibration. The mental ledger of a woman realizing she'd misjudged an asset. Osei, to his credit, looked simply delighted, the way a man looks when he's just watched a good story unfold in real time. "The dock," Harriet said finally, faintly, as though this were the detail that mattered most. "You the grounds crew comment." "I thought." "I know what you thought," Wes said, not unkindly. There was no triumph in his voice. None of the sharp satisfaction Corinne might have wanted for him. Might have felt herself in his position. He said it the way he talked, about a house that had been neglected for decades and needed patient work, not blame. "It happens. I look like what I am. Most days a guy who works with his hands and doesn't own a suit. I've never seen much reason to apologize for it." He glanced briefly, at Corinne, and something passed between them, warm and steady. The particular language of 6 years of marriage. Anyway, not here to make anyone uncomfortable. I just came to check the roofline and talk to Grant about the lease. The dock repair's actually already scheduled for next week. If anyone was worried, he said it lightly, and somehow that lightness did more than any pointed remark could have. Corinne felt it move through the group, like a held breath, finally released the particular, sheepish silence of people confronting the gap between what they'd assumed and what was true, and finding themselves smaller for it, though no one had made them feel that way on purpose. Grant Whitfield recovered first, in the manner of a man who had built a career on recovering gracefully. He stood, extended his hand, and said, "Weston, it's an honor, genuinely. This lodge has hosted this firm's best decisions for 11 years. I had no idea we owed that kind of gratitude to a single family. Just doing what my grandfather would have wanted," Wes said, shaking his hand. "Place gets used. That's better than it sitting empty." Corinne watched Harriet approach afterward, watched her attempt with more grace than Corinne would have credited her, a kind of sideways apology, framed as a question about the timber framing, about how a person even learns a trade like that. Wes answered her plainly, without an edge, describing the mortise and tenon joints his grandfather had cut by hand, the particular way old-growth oak ages differently than the lumber available today. He was, Corinne realized, watching him, not performing forgiveness. He simply didn't carry the slight the way she had carried it on his behalf, for 2 full days. Hadn't needed her defense in the first place. Hadn't needed the deed to prove anything to himself at all. The deed had only ever been paperwork. His sense of who he was had never once required Thistlewood Lodge, or Grant Whitfield's respect, or anyone's permission. Later that afternoon, while Wes walked the roofline with the level tucked under his arm, checking the same joists his grandfather had raised 60 years before, Corinne found herself standing at the porch rail beside Osei, who was watching Wes work with open admiration. "Your husband built any of the additions himself?" Osei asked. "The east wing looks newer, the pergola over the boathouse," Corinne said, surprising herself with how much she knew, how much she'd absorbed over 6 years, without ever quite cataloging it. "He did that 2 summers ago, said the old one was rotting through, and his grandfather would have hated seeing it fall down neglected." Osei nodded slowly. "You must be proud." Corinne watched Wes crouch at the roof's edge, testing a beam with the flat of his palm, utterly at ease 60 feet in the air on a structure his grandfather had built by hand, entirely unconcerned with whether anyone on the ground below was watching. She thought about the porch 2 nights before, about the hot flush of her own embarrassment, about how she'd flinched at mud on a man's boots instead of remembering, even for a second, everything those boots had built. "I am," she said, and found that this time, the word carried none of the old, uneasy weight it had carried on the first night. None of the calculation, none of the fear of what the partners would think. It was simply true, plain as a deed, with his name typed across the top, and she was ashamed it had taken a stranger's question and a folder of old paperwork to say it out loud the way she should have said it from the very start. That evening, the partners gathered on the porch one last time before the retreat ended, and for once, Corinne did not feel like a woman standing at the edge of a party she hadn't been invited to. Wes sat beside her, boots clean, hands scarred and steady, and when Harriet Voss raised her glass to toast the weekend, she looked directly at him and said, without irony, that she hoped he'd come back next June, muddy boots and all. Wes only laughed, low and easy, and reached for Corinne's hand under the table, and Corinne thought, watching the lake go dark and gold at the edges, that some things a person builds are visible from 60 feet up on a rooftop, and some things a person builds are quieter than that, and take longer to notice, and matter just as much.